Hello? The power of a microphone. I love it. OCO, everyone. So, hi, I'm Liza Black. I'm a faculty member here at Indiana University and a fellow at Harvard University. I'm so excited about this event. I hope you all are having a great time. I'm going to say OCO, and you're going to say OCO back to me. So OCO is Cherokee. I'm Cherokee Nation, and that's how we just say hello. I wish I could say that you're saying land back, but you're just saying hello. So OCO. Yes, awesome. Okay, so I am here to introduce our amazing keynote speaker. Before I do that, I'm going to give a land acknowledgement. And this is my land acknowledgement. This does not reflect the opinions of the trustees or Indiana University or my department chair or anybody besides me. I would like to begin by acknowledging that our meeting is taking place on Native land. These are the traditional lands of the Miami, Potawatomi, Delaware, Kickapoo, and Shawnee nations. Why are there no reservations in the state of Indiana? Why are there no federally recognized tribes in Indiana? The tribes of Indiana, in particular the Miami, were denied their treaty rights by the state of Indiana and the United States. Together, they seized Miami lands by way of fraud. The Pagaugan Band are the only tribal community with tribal lands in Indiana, and these are trust lands without the full legal protection of reservation land. In that sense, Indiana is one of the only states in America with no reservation per se. Thus, I want to acknowledge these tribal nations' ancestral claims to these lands and their survival on these same lands. I want to acknowledge the continued presence of these tribes in Indiana as well as Oklahoma and beyond. We've all seen memes making fun of land acknowledgements, and some of us have, I make my students look them up, some such as Anishinaabe scholar Hayden King argue that land acknowledgements can become at best an empty ritual, and at worst a pardon and permission for occupying indigenous lands. I agree with King wholeheartedly with his call for land acknowledgements to hold within them an obligation to continue to build knowledge around land claims and to collaborate with local tribes in their writing. The land acknowledgement should be part of a larger process and commitment when done as part of an institution. The acknowledgement should be embraced at the highest levels of the institution, and as King puts it, breathe life into their obligations to those communities. I believe land acknowledgements continue to be relevant and should be part of an effort to decolonize and indigenize higher education. And now I have the honor of introducing our keynote. I'm going to read her biography, and thankfully she will be speaking about her language and using her language correctly, which I probably will not. But please help me in welcoming Aluki. She is originally from Igloolik. We didn't practice that word. Igloolik. Now residing, we didn't practice a bunch of these words. Now residing in Iqaluit. She's like, oh God. This is like, this is why I teach my language. With her family, Nunavut Tunavik, President Aluki Kotierk leads by example. Aluki is driven by her passion to empower and improve the lives of Inuit. After earning her master's degree in Native and Canadian Studies at Trent University, Aluki worked for various Inuit organizations, including, let's have you say it. Inuit Women of Canada, Inuit of Canada, now known as Isn't it beautiful? I love hearing her speak. And Nunavut.
Where are we? Nunavut.
Yes. She has also held management and deputy minister roles within the government of Nunavut, Office of the Languages Commissioner, and Nunavut Tugavik Incorporated. In her current role as president, Aluki is keen in how Inuit language and culture can be better incorporated into the way in which programs and services are designed and delivered in Nunavut. Aluki is former co-chair representing Indigenous peoples organizations on the Global Task Force for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, 2022 to 2032, and is currently a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples for the Arctic region. Please welcome Aluki.
Koyan nami, tisaksa ko kama. Koyan nami lai sa tunga suk titaw kama tamaw nga. Ako via suldarik po nga tamaw nga unikare aktor nak titaw kama. O kausilirin o kausiril ko ko via gin nak para kataw katarak ko. Ko via sik tunga o kausiri yung nakako ulumi. Kadya nak tumariw do nila ulumi novi period tilo. Ningi orilaw tamanal diw ti viane katitun nakatako viana. Anikuta ko lugar ulumi nadliutik manadliutik ti ako vaka. Koyan na meron may yung anaregator si magasi o kausilirin ng mo kausakang natilunga. As an Inuk woman, I wanted to start off speaking Inuktitut. Inuktitut is the dialect I speak. It's a dialect of the Canadian Eastern Arctic. We refer to all the dialects of Inuit as Inuktitut, and they transcend the borders. So Inuit exists across the circumpolar global Arctic. The reason I wanted to speak not just with a greeting was because I strongly believe that each time any of us Indigenous peoples speak our language, anytime we utter a word, it's an act of resistance. Every time we utter a word, it's an act of self-determination. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge and thank the organizing committee for inviting me to be a part of this conference. What an honor it is to be invited to the first conference. But I will have to admit that I had to look up Bloomington to see where I was going. But words are so important, right? And Bloomington, I mean, for me, when I was thinking about the word Bloomington, it conjures up springtime when the land is thawing and the snow is glistening in the bright sun, and you can see patches of land starting to bloom and grow. I didn't look up why Bloomington is called Bloomington, but that's what I thought. But of course, I'm from the Arctic, so in the springtime, it's a magnificent time where the sun seems to last forever and we have the midnight sun. So it's a joyous occasion, I think. And so Bloomington kind of conjured that up for me. Today, I know, I forgot to even start my timer because I was told that I had about 45 minutes and then we'll open it up for questions or comments so that there's some interaction. But I will warn you that I wrote so much, I will stop at 45 minutes, but hopefully what I've written doesn't surpass that. Today, I want to talk to you about love and dreams. I will share with you a love story, a love so deep that it motivates one, despite all odds from the depths of one's soul. This love story is twofold. First, it is a love about our languages. Each of our languages is an incredibly rich vessel of a worldview that enriches all of our lives. While I spoke in Inuktitut, while I speak in Inuktitut, I want each of you as Indigenous peoples to be thinking about your own languages. Aren't there times in which you wished everyone understood your language so you could quickly convey concepts that are easily conveyed in your own Indigenous language? I think of words like ataksokto. Inuit love relatives. Naming is a common practice in Inuit culture. Ataksokto is when a person behaves or has the mannerisms of a person that they're named after. As an example, I have a young niece that is named after my late grandmother. I call her grandmother, or Ningil. One of my aunts calls her Anana, or mother. When she was younger, she would often want to light the Kotierk, which was a different mannerism than her other siblings at that age. One of my aunts commented, "Atak soktukuru." In that moment, as we recognized the mannerisms or behaviors, we felt loving endearment simultaneously towards my niece, but also towards my late grandmother. In one word, you conjured up so much connection with what was and what is. I think of words like angnaleak or angusiak or pukuluk or sipinak or inunguinak, concepts that as an Inuk, I understand deeply, but it requires many words to sort of describe it in English, and you still suspect it falls short of fully describing it. I love our language. It is so specific. In Inuktitut, my father's sister is my attak, and my mother's sister is ayak, while in English, both these people would be my aunt. It is similar with the English word cousin. In Inuktitut, I would differentiate between my cousins, who are my father's brother's cousins, or my father's brother's children, or my father's sister's children, or my mother's sister's children, etc. Isn't that so great? I love Inuktitut. Secondly, equally important, is the love for those family and community members who use our languages. There are community members who work so hard to ensure that our language is supported and remains a living language. There are Inuit who are unilingual and speak only Inuktitut. They are strong contributing members of our communities. We look to them for advice and wisdom. Often, they are the rocks of our families. Yet, far too often, because essential public services are available only in English, you see that they are not their independent, confident self, as they have to rely on the informal interpretation services of their grandchild, of their niece, or some random bilingual Inuk that happens to be around. As you see this in your community, as you see strong, independent community members not able to fully function in society because their mother tongue is not used, a deep feeling starts to bubble up inside. This is not right. This is not fair. How can a person who was born here, who has lived here, who will die here, no longer be able to function independently in their own homeland? This strong feeling of wanting to protect is called sirnana. It can be a strong force for motivation. I know that it has fueled me to have the courage to speak up when I have felt scared, insignificant, and intimidated. Love can be a powerful force. It actually has allowed me to put aside my feelings of being shy. It actually helped me when I'm in this position to think of specific people. Who specifically are you advocating for? I suspect that this really strong feeling of silnangnek fueled the young Inuit in the early 1970s to dream big, audacious dreams. Dreams that seemed unsurmountable. In Canada, between the 1940s and 1960s, Inuit were moved from the land to communities. There were very rapid social changes. Inuit learned a new lifestyle. Inuit children were sent away from their families to residential schools. At school, Inuit children met other Inuit children from other parts of Inuit Nunangat, Inuit homeland. They shared lived experiences. A founding member and the first president of the National Inuit Organization in Canada, Inuit Tapere Kanatami, Taga Curley, in reflecting on that time period, is quoted to have said, Our elders were starting to feel depression. It was frightening. My question to the elders was, is it worth saving Inuit culture, or should we discard it and learn white ways? They said, Inuit culture must not be lost. Inuit language must not be lost. Very quickly, Inuit learned a new language, learned a new governance system, and used this knowledge to their advantage to advocate for our land claims. In a sense, they acted as bridges between two different worlds. It may be appropriate to characterize them as cultural interpreters because they had to understand both worldviews intimately enough to be able to interpret and package concepts in a way the other worldview would understand. The most stark difference in worldviews was the notion of land ownership. In the Inuit worldview, land cannot be owned. Yet, there is a whole land claims process that is based upon the notion of land ownership. Young bilingual Inuit, as young as 19 years old, had a big audacious dream that they would use the land claims process to change the map of Canada and recognize an Inuit territory. They spent many years away from family and traveling, working hard to advocate for Inuit rights. Through their efforts and dedication in Canada, there are now 4 settled Inuit land claims agreements that cover the entirety of Inuit Nunangat, Inuit homeland. I will keep saying Inuit Nunangat, and that's just how we say Inuit homeland. The settlement of each land claim conjured up great hope and dreams for Inuit. The Nunavut Agreement, an agreement negotiated by Inuit and the Crown, was signed in 1993. Article 4 of this agreement established the Nunavut Territory, the Nunavut Legislative Assembly, and the territorial public government. The Nunavut Territory became a separate territory in Canada on April 1st, 1999. The first mandate document, the Bathurst Mandate of the first government of Nunavut stated, and I quote, "In 2020, Nunavut is a place where Inuktitut in all its forms is the working language of the government of Nunavut." Inuit envisioned that once Nunavut was created, that they would get better services and programs, not only in their language, a language that they understood and preferred, but that these services and programs would better reflect Inuit ways of understanding and being. In fact, in April 1990, the agreement in principle was signed in my home community of Igloolik. At the time, the Tungavik Federation of Nunavut President Kwasa included in his remarks, and I quote, "We assert the right to use Inuktitut in all facets of life in Nunavut. Along with English and French, Inuktitut should be recognized by the Government of Canada as the official language in Nunavut. We insist, too, that our children have the constitutional right to be educated in Inuktitut." Very briefly, for those who may not be aware, Nunavut is made up of 25 communities where the public majority are Inuit. That means 85% of us, 85% of the population is Inuit. And the first language of the public majority is Inuktitut. Nunavut is the only jurisdiction in Canada that has a majority language that is not one of the federally recognized official languages of French and English. In Canada, our language, Inuktitut, is considered to be one of the stronger Indigenous languages, yet it is declining at 1% per year. And if it continues at this rate, by 2051, only 4% of us will be speaking Inuktitut at home. If the story ended here, I would be here telling you a tragic love story, a story of a failed dream. Fortunately, the story continues. We can continue to be lovesick, practical dreamers. I am of the belief that it will have a happy ending. I believe that one day Inuktitut will be the working language of our government within Nunavut, and that it will be the language used to provide essential public services to the public majority Inuit population. At this point, I want to pause and just acknowledge that this is hard work. Not only is it hard work, but it can be emotionally draining, given that we can be personally invested in the goal. It is my view that it is important for people working in these areas and advocating for fellow Indigenous peoples and the betterment of our lives to take the long view. Each of us is building upon the work of fellow Indigenous peoples before us, and we are making positive contributions currently, and we can pass the torch on to other Indigenous peoples who will continue to do this important work. We must remain clear on what our dream is, what we want to achieve. We must remain clear on why our dream is important, and it is the love of our language and our culture and a deep need to continue to be self-determining peoples. All the processes and instruments and platforms are tools that we can use to achieve our dream. Sometimes the tools work, sometimes the tools are not effective. I constantly remind myself that each time we find ourselves with a new challenge, that it does not diminish all the good work that has already happened. There has been so many incredible achievements to support Indigenous peoples' languages. None of these achievements would have happened without the persistent advocacy of Indigenous peoples. Internationally, there is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In it, Article 13 states, 1, Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. 2, states shall take effective measures to ensure that this right is protected, and also to ensure that Indigenous peoples can understand and be understood in political, legal, and administrative proceedings where necessary through the provision of interpretation or by other appropriate means. Within Canada, the Indigenous Languages Act received royal assent on June 21, 2019. There is a significance to this day. In Canada, June 21 is the National Indigenous Peoples Day, and you will recall that 2019 was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. This legislation recognized the linguistic rights of Indigenous peoples of Canada and committed to working on ways in which to support and revitalize Indigenous languages. In Nunavut, the government of Nunavut worked hard and in partnership with Inuit organizations created and passed the Official Languages Act in June 2008 and the Inuit Languages Protection Act in September 2008. This recognized and affirmed Inuktitut language rights. So, my quick and dirty assessment of these legislation is that it is great that both Canada and Nunavut have language legislations. Unfortunately, there is a great difference in the treatment of languages in the Indigenous Languages Act of Canada compared to the Official Languages Act of Canada. In the Indigenous Languages Act, it states under Article 10, a federal institution or its agent or mandatory may, in accordance with the regulations, provide access to services in an Indigenous language if the institution or its agent or mandatory has the capacity to do so, and there is sufficient demand for access to those services in that language. In comparison, Article 23 of the Official Languages Act of Canada, which of course deals with French and English, states, for greater certainty, in addition to the duty set out in Section 22, every federal institution that provides services or makes them available to the traveling public has the duty to ensure that any member of the traveling public can communicate with and obtain those services in either official languages from any office or facility of the institution in Canada or elsewhere where there is significant demand for those services in that language. You'll note for the Official Languages Act, it is merely if there is a demand, whereas for the Indigenous Languages Act, it states if there is capacity. In terms of the territorial legislation, the failure lays in the implementation and resourcing of the legislation. Similar to the comments made yesterday by the keynote speakers, you can have great agreements, but if you don't provide the resources to support it, it will not be implemented. Inuit continue to be very active regionally, nationally, and internationally through our various Inuit organizations. While there was an Inuit political movement happening within Canada, around the same time, Inuit around the circumpolar world were actively strengthening formal connections and establishing the Inuit Circumpolar Council in 1977. In my view, it is very important that we show up to participate in the various UN systems. The reality is that many mechanisms are overwhelmed and do not have enough time or finances, so they often welcome suggestions and volunteers. I think I wanted to add that Inuit have showed support for UNDRIP, for the International Year of Indigenous Languages, for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and continue to participate in various international fora, whether it be related to climate change, food security, or the discussions happening on enhanced participation. And I think it's really important to state that allyship is crucially important when you're working on the international spaces. And I know that Inuit have benefited by working closely with our fellow Arctic Indigenous peoples, the Sami. And that has resulted in good work happening in the Arctic region. I wanted to share a few instances where I felt good about the Inuit contribution. In June 2021, there was a joint North America and Arctic regional consultation held related to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022-2032, the Global Action Plan. By working with Sami Arctic colleagues, we were able to suggest Arctic participants. And for my part, I contacted Inuit ahead of time and asked them if they were willing and if they were available to participate in such a consultation. Then I provided those names to UNESCO along with their contact information. I share this because I know sometimes it's really helpful to have practical information. How do I go about getting things done? During the International Decade of Indigenous Languages high-level event that was held in December 2022 in Paris, France, there was an Inuk who lit the Kotierk. For those of you who might not be aware, Kotierk is a steel, it's made out of soapstone often. It's a steel oil lamp, even though we use oils from different mammals. And the point here is that this would not have happened without the work to coordinate the participation. And while I was there in Paris, watching the Kotierk being lit at an international high-level event, far away from Inuit Nunat, it felt like such an emotionally poignant moment in my life. It actually still makes me smile to think, wow, there was an Inuk lighting up Kotierk at an international event. At that same high-level event, I was able to coordinate the connection between Meta, at the time I think it was Facebook, with UNESCO, so that they were also able to take part in that high-level event. It was already mentioned, but I was the co-chair for the Global Task Force for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages from June 2022 to December 2023. And through my involvement in that role at the Global Task Force, as Arctic regional participants, we would always have an Arctic region pre-meeting to talk about whether or not we wanted to provide specific comments or input on agenda items. For instance, we would discuss the Global Action Plan and determine whether we needed to request revisions, or we would discuss whether or not we wanted to suggest a person to do the traditional opening ceremony of the meeting, whether it be a Sami Yoik, for instance. So I made that comment about allyship, but I see many of these interactions as opportunities, and there's no such thing as luck. You have to be prepared for opportunities. And so in preparation for a global meeting, you work with the people in your region, so you have a coordinated approach to how you're addressing things. Currently, I'm a co-chair for the ad hoc committee, or the ad hoc group 3. It's focused on recognition, status, and implementation of policy for Indigenous languages. And so all these roles are voluntary. But I think it's crucially important that we volunteer and show up for these things. And so you can only imagine, after I spoke about the legislations in Canada and in Nunavut, why I would be so interested in ad hoc group 3. I'm particularly interested in how to get things implemented. From each experience, we learn new things and we do better. During one of the Global Task Force meetings, there was a presentation, and I'm going to pick on them for a bit, presentation by the Scottish government. I questioned why they were presenting when we were focused on Indigenous languages. The UNESCO official indicated that UNESCO uses the principle of inclusivity, and it is Indigenous languages and not Indigenous peoples' languages. Although the response frustrated me, I was sure to remember it when we were working on this year's Permanent Forum report. You may notice that it consistently references Indigenous peoples' languages, even though it adds to the word count. All this to say that when we show up as Indigenous peoples, we make a positive contributions to the discussions. I would urge you to continue to show up. In addition to showing up, I mentioned how important it is to be prepared, and I think reviewing documents and making sure you can see your peoples included in the words of the document is important. And so that was a process we did in terms of the Global Action Plan for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages and the 10 outputs. In my mind, I was like, do I see Inuit in here? Does it talk about public essential services? Does it talk about Inuktitut? I mean, it won't specifically say Inuktitut language of instruction, but it will say Indigenous people's language of instruction. So you say, okay, what are the things that are important to the people I belong to? And can I see them in the document? And if you don't see yourself in the document, that's when you say, excuse me, I would like to make a suggestion. So we've had the International Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019. We now have the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. So work will continue on Indigenous peoples' languages, but what's the next step after the decade? What will be the outcome of the decade? I know that in the past permanent forum in April, Wilton Littlechild has already started advocating for the establishment of an international convention on Indigenous languages. I would revise that and say Indigenous peoples' languages, and so with the idea that this convention would aim to ensure legal protection, mobilize resources, integrate Indigenous languages into educational systems, and strengthen cultural heritage. So the decade is still in the beginning, and yet he's already started raising this. And you can hear it if you're alert to it. You will hear it at the side events where it keeps being raised. And I wanted to raise that because things take so much time. And so if you have a brilliant idea, you start mentioning it over time. And then one day, while we're still alive, we will see it come to fruition. Historically, we know that Canada funded buildings and personnel to actively strip Indigenous peoples of their culture, including their language, through residential school. In my view, Canada should and has the responsibility to fund buildings and personnel to actively rebuild, strengthen, and protect Indigenous languages. Further, I am of the view that Canada should seriously consider changing the Constitution so that Inuktitut is recognized as equal to French and English within Nunavut. It is entirely open to the Canadian government to give statutory official status protection to Inuktitut within Nunavut without impairing the constitutional rights pertaining to French and English. Maybe then would Inuktitut receive sufficient and equitable resources so that it continues to thrive as an official language of Nunavut. Although I maintain these views, I also think about how and what I can do in the sphere of control that I have. I think this helps me feel like things are continuing to progress. Since December 2016, I have been the president for Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated. Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, otherwise known as NTI, is the organization that represents all Nunavut Inuit and advocates for the full implementation of the Nunavut Agreement and ensures that Inuit rights are upheld. I want to highlight a number of important things that we have been able to achieve at NTI. In March 2019, during the International Year of Indigenous Languages, NTI invested $5.4 million of Inuit money into the Perorvik Center to deliver accredited Inuktitut language training programs. Further, NTI announced that we were going to support our employees by offering Inuktitut language training with the goal of achieving Inuktitut as our working language. In July 2020, NTI invested $2.4 million of Inuit money into Inuit TV to establish an educational broadcaster that will provide Inuktitut programming available on television. In July 2020, NTI launched the Inuktitut Writing Prize. It is a way to increase the availability of books and other literature in Inuktitut. The first prize is $80,000 and supports to continue writing over a year, including a writing residency and mentorship to develop the material into a book. In February, it was actually February 21, 2022, as Inuit of the Circumpolar region, we held a virtual launch of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages and had Inuit from Kalatli, Nunat, Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka take part virtually in that launch. In July 2022, after a 4-year partnership, Meta with NTI announced that the Facebook desktop interface is now available in Inuktitut. This was an initiative to ensure that Inuktitut is available in all aspects of our lives. In July 2023, during an Inuit Circumpolar Conference that was held in Ilulissat, Kalatli, Nunat, along with a colleague, we facilitated a workshop focused on Inuit languages and the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. On October 13, 2021, this day was not a good day. Along with 2 Inuit families, I walked over to the Nunavut Court of Justice to file a claim against the government of Nunavut for their failure to provide public education in Inuktitut, which is currently only delivered in English or French after grade 3, if at all. That we claim that it's discriminatory against Inuit families and breaches the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter guarantees the fundamental rights of Canadians and prohibits discrimination based on race and ethnicity. Since that time, the government of Nunavut continues to appeal, and most recently on October 24 of this year, the government of Nunavut have filed an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada and is trying once again to have the lawsuit dismissed without a trial on the evidence. October 13, 2021, after walking over to the Nunavut Court of Justice, I went back to my office and I had a meltdown. I could not believe that as the head of an Inuit organization that negotiated a treaty with the Crown, that through Article 4 of our agreement, where we created a territorial public government with the idea that the public majority Inuit population's needs would be addressed, that I had to take that drastic step to say the government we created is not looking out for the well-being of Inuit, the social well-being, the cultural well-being, the economic well-being. In November last year, 2023, NTI held a gathering of Inuktitut language experts to determine what we can do and what can be contained in a Nunavut Inuit action plan for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. We have recently completed a draft, and you'll note that in the Global Task Force Global Action Plan, it encourages nations to develop national or regional action plans. And so we've made presentations at Inuit Circumpolar Council, we've made presentations at the Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, but then, as I said earlier, at some point you have to say, what do I have control over? And so I said, okay, in Nunavut, we will have a plan. So that's the intention. Finally, I feel like I've talked a lot, but finally, I want to conclude by reminding Indigenous peoples that we can play an important role as individuals in our day-to-day lives and in our workplaces to strengthen Indigenous languages and to ensure that our languages continue to thrive. I am sure that you can think of things that you can do. Let's encourage each other to speak and use our Indigenous languages. Let's create safe and comfortable spaces so that Indigenous peoples who are relearning their Indigenous languages feel supported to keep trying. Let's encourage more Indigenous peoples to become teachers. Let us use our Indigenous languages names and encourage the use of Indigenous languages names. Remember, each of these acts are an act of resistance. Each of these acts are an assertion of self-determination. Despite the continued colonial impacts, we are still here. let us continue to hold love and dreams. Hoyan namin. Thank you. Hoyan namin. I think there's a little bit of time, so if there's any comments, I don't mind if it's comments and not questions. But it's now open for anyone who wants to make a comment or question.
Urtzi Rutikoetxea, Basque writer and activist and all these things that we do for our languages. We recently have a PEN International Linguistic Rights Committee meeting in SAPME in Inari with the writers and working in the Sami languages, as they say, not one language but different ones, and also they start to establish some contacts with the writers in Greenland. They participated in one of our small projects we have with the video poems marathon we celebrate every February. They are trying to see how they can form their own Sami Pen Center, as they have been forming recently some indigenous pen centers around the world, with this idea that pen has worked for more than a century for freedom of speech, and we always think in writers and jailing journalists and things like that. But the motto that I've been working these last 10, 15 years is that one of the worst attacks against freedom of speech is the loss of a language. So in this sense, my question that I wanted to mention, you already mentioned how you're working with other nations and other peoples in the polar area, polar circle area. How is exactly the approach that, for instance, Greenland has taken many steps to, for instance, one of the, at least I know the title in the newspaper was that they wanted to focus more in the Greenlandic, in the Kalaallisut language, more than Danish, and also making, coming closer to English in education rather than Danish. But it's, I guess, understandable in that case that the real threat maybe it can be the assimilation from Danish. So to what extent you are inspired to working together with Greenland and the situation over there?
Thank you for the question. I think we can take great inspiration from Greenland. I've been to Kalaallit Nunaat a number of times, and I remember the first time I went there being struck by how there could be a room full of Kalaallit with one Dane, and they're all speaking Kalaallisut. Whereas in Nunavut, we can have the same scenario where we're all Inuit and one Kaldonak, one white person, and we're all speaking English because we want them to feel welcomed. We want to be polite. So Canadian of us. But so, and I. Yeah, so I remember leaving Kalaallit Nunaat and thinking, how does that happen? And I remember speaking when I was first elected into this role. One of the first things I did was I called a former premier of Kalaallit Nunaat, and I said, I want to understand a bit more about how you're able to have Kalaallisut everywhere. Because in Nunavut, we're too polite. And I have lived by the advice she gave me to this day. She said, you're Inuk, be unapologetically Inuk. And so I've been to conferences in Inuit Nunaat, in Nunavut, where I speak only in Inuktitut, whether or not there's interpretation. Because people, when they come to our homeland, should know where they've arrived. And so I think to be bold and unapologetic is an approach that has been helpful for me because I'm naturally timid. And I think that in this past year, we've had a regular scheduled flight between Iqaluit and Nuuk, which has really strengthened the communication and the learning from each other that is occurring between the borders.
Parlarik bin. Ariga kairavin, ariga tautu kapkin, wanga ano kek tau miuhu ronga. Angizu kakanu luku taglu mark palaklu, atataka nuhusaglu, kungaglu, dinguglu. Inyunya niralwaktunga kek tami aglang ilat ka inujut tamani. Uanga uvangilachlungu, Iniklu kerektami, tema asi, ilisa tahlunga akak tuinemek, sujanek aluk neklu, suli eraloknek, angakma malik tilalunga, anguniagamek, neksaneklu tutoneklu, aglizaktunga utkervingmi asi, tema nirila laktunga makdangmek, Akia Elisauri jok inupeatun ipalok elementary mi. Temanamek nagoriga Elisalek inupeatun. Avaga unyaga tukimuk tinek. Sinak tugama ilan kavikuzwi langa. Ola gutino inupirak nek ila ni kavigugaloak tunga. Inupirak nemek, kanuata sakik natok. Aglan kavik kuzwi langa te manamek, siut mulatunga. Ukaw sekput binyag naktot, echusiagikput, kengunip tinyun. Sava kaktugut angi roamek, ukagniak tunga ay marvip tinyi. So I'm an oak. I welcome you. I'm from Shishmaref, Alaska, and my family has lived there for thousands of years, and that's where I learned to harvest our greens and berries and fish. And it's also the place where I've learned to hunt caribou and seal. And I shared with you also that I learned to love the Inupiaq language when my mom taught Inupiaq immersion in Utqiagvik. And in a sense, I followed her path because I continued to teach the Inupiaq language. And I'm just so grateful to hear about in Nunavut how much the language is present and in schools and is gaining more and more traction and recognition. And I just want to thank you for your incredible advocacy in uplifting all these languages. And I'm here on behalf of ACPIRG, which is the Alaska Public Interest Research Group. And this organization has hosted Alaska Native language panels so that our languages are visible throughout our state in all the programs and services that serve us. And so I just wanted to share with you how much it means to be an Inuit person and to hear your journey. And we very much see the Kalaallisut and Inuit in Canada as a light of hope because we have about maybe 5 or 7% of our population in Alaska are speakers of our Inupiaq language. And it's a very different story in Canada and Greenland, where the majority our speakers. And I also just wanted to share that in our communities, we are growing in our immersion efforts and doing immersion for our children. And I greeted you in my Inupiaq dialect, but also another Inupiaq dialect furthest north. And learning Inupiaq and reclaiming it in the face of so many odds can be so incredibly heavy. And but I just want to say to all of you working on your languages, the strength that we have when we speak and the connection that we have to our ancestors and our community and our culture makes us an unstoppable force. And part of the reason why I'm here also is because of the way that climate change has impacted our communities. And Shishmaraf or Kotierk has been trying to relocate for several decades because of erosion and flooding. And part of our panel presentation was how we use our indigenous languages to respond to the environment and using our knowledges and our indigenous wisdom that's embedded in our languages to envision a future where we have agency and control over how our communities are thriving into the future, where we are still connected within our kinship systems and we are still supported strongly by our languages. And I'm curious to hear from you a little bit about, I know this issue in the Arctic of climate change and relocation is happening across the circumpolar Arctic, and I'm just curious to hear from you what's happening in Nunavut and what the government in Nunavut is doing to ensure that our communities have a governance structure that supports a relocation in a dignified way and that speaks to our human rights as Inuit people. And so I see Inuit in Canada and Greenland as my relatives, and I also recognize how how far along you all have come, and I think there's great opportunity for us to join together as we have done in ICC and other forums or fora. So, darja koyanakpak.
Koyanakpak. Tukisikará tegit. O kausiriya kisuriyogun. Okperbing min nikuvunga. Una okperbing min. Pilautara. I think because the talk was about language, I'll connect with you after to talk about climate change. But one thing I wanted to speak a little bit about was as an Indigenous person learning an Indigenous language, the burden, the emotional toll it takes on a person. And I say this because there are young Inuit who don't speak Inuktitut in Nunavut, and they carry a great amount of shame. But it's not their shame. It's the shame brought upon them due to the assimilation and the colonial approaches of sending people to residential schools. There are parents who would prefer their children learn in English because of colonization, that you start thinking English is the more superior language than your own Indigenous language. And through the Pilvik Center, which I mentioned, we've provided funds to. They have a stream of Inuktitut language training for Inuit, and no other people are able to join it because there's a recognition that there's an emotional healing component of relearning a language that was rightfully could have been your mother tongue, And also, I think Inuit, when they start doing that training, realize they know much more than they thought they knew. because they're amongst Inuit and we're always speaking Inuktitut. So they're picking up Inuktitut without saying, I'm a fluent speaker. And I share this because I know when I went to university, I took a couple years of Spanish, and there was no emotional shame when I said things wrong. There's a dish in Ecuador, yaguar locro, and I remember saying, oh, quisiera comer yaguar. Instead of saying yaguar locro, I said, agua loco, right? And then I bawled with laughter because I was like, oh my God, that's not what I meant, right? But there was no shame because I'm like, I'm not supposed to speak Spanish. Like, whatever. This is a new thing. I'm learning this. It's an addition to my life. Whereas when you're an Inuk learning Inuktitut, there's a shame that you should have already known. And how is it that you're trying to learn? So I wanted to just pick up on that because and recognize what an emotional burden it is when you're an Indigenous person who doesn't speak. And that's why I said we need to create safe spaces as Indigenous peoples to encourage Indigenous peoples to use their language and reclaim it as their own.
Thank you so much for your encouragement. I am an indigenous Quichua from the Yaguar Locro land. Actually, it's my favorite dish, and tripamishke as well. I would like to understand, I do come from generational trauma, as you talk about colonialism. It has been so hard, you know, to leave that behind, seeing the grandmothers crying and passing through all the atrocities that had happened to my family lineage, like rape, taking the lands as well, polluting the waters. How the community from you are addressing that to heal that, to continue. It is hard, I'm sorry, but I'm glad you brought this topic. Thanks.
You can hear me? No. I should have kept my fingers away.
It fell. That's
Oh,
what happened.
oh, now, okay. I'll just hold it like this. Okay, we can do this. So, one of the things in Nunavut particularly is Article 3 of our agreement speaks to Inuit employment and achieving a representative workforce. So the idea is that the government of Nunavut, or governments in all its forms, including the government of Nunavut as well as the Canadian government within the Nunavut settlement area, needs to achieve an Inuit employment level that is representative of our population. So that would mean that it would be 85% at every level. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it's so important for Inuit to be able to speak with healers, with Inuit mental health workers that understand Inuit culture, that speak Inuktitut. And yet, because of government systems, and I really think there needs to be a systematic change, there's a lack of recognition or validation of Indigenous people's knowledges, and so then things don't get accredited. So even as Inuit, we might say that person is really good and helps with healing, but they're not recognized by the government system, and so they're not able to get compensated, and we're saying we need to get them compensated. So that's an area of concern. But as an Inuit organization, because we recognize that there needs to be supports to help us heal and go through the hurts that we carry collectively, and the coping mechanisms we see where people become addicted to alcohol or other substances, and there is no addictions trauma treatment center in our territory. One of the things we've started to do over the last few years is set up a tripartite partnership table between Inuit organizations, NTI, the government of Nunavut, as well as the government of Canada, where we talked about the lack of the Addictions Trauma Treatment Center. And I am proud, very proud to say that by next year, there's a building being built right now. By next year, the Addictions Trauma Treatment Center will be open. But it's not enough to build infrastructure. It's not enough to build the facility. What we advocated as an Inuit organization is that once it's built, it needs to have Inuit employees that speak Inuktitut, that understand Inuit culture, and we put money towards training Inuit in anticipation of this facility to open. So the expectation will be next year, there'll be Inuit ready and trained and recognized to be able to work in that facility. So we did a 3-pillar project, okay? So the infrastructure, the Inuit employees, and the third approach is the on-the-land healing. Because not every Inuk wants to travel from their community to a city. And I call Iqaluit a city. It's a city for us, but there's less than 10,000 people, so we'll leave it to you to decide if it's a city. And not everyone wants to travel to the city. And so the third pillar is an on-the-land program with Inuit counselors that we've trained with the help of a grassroots organization called Ilisaksinak, and they're training Inuit with Inuit cultural values in Inuktitut to be the counselors so that they can also deliver on-the-land programming in all our communities. So, thank you. Yeah.
I want to thank you for advocating for you people, Nunavut, and it's very privileged for me to come and attend this meeting, and also and you and Madam Miriam Massaquiza, that you guys advocating in the UN is bring me hope and boldness inside of me. When I'm in Bangladesh, we don't have platform to talk about, and our voice is taken away already by the government. Even the activists, they're doing secretly, hiding, and they cannot do much. They have been under watch by the government, and also Myanmar, and also even in India. So we are going through this kind of situation, and I was hopeless. I want to talk, but I don't have place to talk, and I don't have people to share. But it's coming here to see you, and Madam Miriam, it's bring me really hope. Thanks for what you're doing for the indigenous people, and one day the light will come and bring hope and bring joy in our life, even the small people in Bangladesh, and we can come up and speak for our people and speak our poems and language and songs and music. I'm very excited, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comment. I agree with it wholeheartedly. I think gatherings where indigenous peoples from different parts of the globe get together and learn from each other is very inspiring. I mean, we heard from our friend here talking about Nunavut being a light, whereas I'm like, it sucks, we need it better, right? And I'm looking over at Greenland, right? And saying we need to aspire to be like Greenland. And the thing is that it's important that each of us continue to raise the fact that things can be better. Even if others view what we have as good, good is not good enough, right? Indigenous peoples were thriving civilizations. That's what we're striving for, right? So each time each of us makes some positive advancements, it lifts all of us up. So thank you for your comments. And I will say, I'm not sure who's keeping track of time.
Not me.
Right. And if...
Yeah, I'm afraid that we probably have to. I hate to be the one cutting things off and being the harbinger of darkness, but But I think we have to break for lunch, and I hope the conversations will continue. And we still have more panels to go today. So thank you so much.